Welcome to Commune, a global wellness community and online course platform featuring some of the world's greatest teachers. We are on a mission to inspire, heal, pass down wisdom, and bring the world closer together. This is the Commune podcast, where each week we explore the ideas and practices that help us live this healthy, connected, and purpose-filled life. In addition to our courses on yoga, meditation, and personal development, Commune also offers an array of social impact courses, including Unwinding Prejudice, Redefining Leadership, and Organize a March. If you are interested in enrolling in any of those course offerings for free, please email me at jeffk@onecommune.com. Right now, we can all benefit from learning and growing in order to better serve our communities. Okay, so this week on the podcast, I am joined by Charles Eisenstein. For those of you who listen regularly to the podcast or read my weekly newsletter, you know that few modern thinkers have influenced me in the way I understand the world more than Charles. Charles is the author of numerous books, including The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible, The Ascent of Humanity, and Sacred Economics. More recently, Charles has written two extremely influential essays that have made their way extensively around the internet. The Coronation, an in-depth look at our human response to the pandemic, and The Conspiracy Myth, an examination of the ground conditions that have given rise to the plethora of conspiracy theories that are gripping us across the political spectrum. Both these pieces are thorough investigations into the modern state of the human condition and should be read. He is also the author of a new course on Commune called Political Hope. On today's show, Charles and I discuss the spike in COVID cases in the United States, the inability of Americans to socially cohere, the undermining of the institutions of science and journalism, the arrogance of science and the need for humility, and our modern understanding of death. My name is Jeff Krasno, and welcome to Commune. So thank you, Charles Eisenstein, for being on the podcast. And I can say I'm not alone in my appreciation for your thought, your critical thinking, and your writing on the topic of COVID. And I'll just maybe set the stage for where we are today globally. On July 2nd, with regards to the pandemic, which now has an estimated 10.7 million global cases, 2.7 million of which are in the United States, over 500,000 total global reported deaths, 128,000 of which are in the United States. And we are now currently experiencing, of course, if you believe mainstream news sources, a spike in reported cases in the United States to the tune of about 40,000 new cases per day. And we have seen other countries struggle, such as Brazil, Russia, India, the UK to some degree, in controlling COVID. And then we've also seen some success stories in China to some degree, though there is some evidence of kind of new efflorescence of cases there, but certainly in many of the island nations, Iceland, New Zealand, Taiwan, also Ireland, Norway, and potentially the bigger success story in Germany. So kind of with that setup, I'll yield some of the balance of my time to you in terms of just, where are we with this? And, and, to what degree can you, um, why are some cultures and countries seem to be succeeding in managing this crisis and others are not?
Well, that's quite a tempting invitation, Jeff, to state my opinions as if they were fact in answer to that question.
Fair enough.
Because and then maybe people will believe me because of maybe the how emphatically I state them and how much evidence that I can adduce to support them. And then, like, you can listen to somebody else who has a different opinion and who also states it very compellingly and draws up his own evidence. Uh, so I'm a little bit, you know, what I'm describing is what I've been going through, looking at different sources who come to radically different conclusions based on actually not based on the same evidence. That's even a deeper part of the problem. It's not only that they disagree on their conclusions, they also disagree on what counts as valid evidence, disagreeing on the provenance of the statistics, and doubting their authenticity. And it gets all clouded by the phenomenon of narrative warfare, where if you are in service to a certain storyline and the results that supports, then even if some data point comes along that's true, if it doesn't fit your narrative warfare, then you're going to ignore it or suppress it or scrutinize it. Um, and we see this happening all the time, which makes it hard to trust anybody. So as far as like these countries that you mentioned, that's part of the confusion for me. Like, I have not found any really good explanation why. You didn't even mention Japan, which is 100 and whatever, 120, 130 million people crammed onto uh, 4 little islands, and many parts of Japan are virtually uninhabited. I mean, the greater Tokyo area has 36 million people, and you've seen. I don't know if you've been to Tokyo, but most people have seen the pictures. I mean, that it is crowded, and they didn't have lockdown, and their cases were very, very low. Like, why? And we kind of have this go-to explanation. Well, they were very successful in contact tracing and collectivist society, et cetera. People obey the rules and so forth. But that seems to be grasping at straws. Um, and so I don't think that we really have any idea what's going on here. Even without the confusing maelstrom of data, conflicting sources of information. So right now, yeah, you talked about we have a spike, and some people I read are saying that that is an artifact of more extensive testing. You test more people, of course, you're going to have a lot more quote cases. And I'm like, okay, is that actually true? And if it is true, then we shouldn't be seeing a lot more people in the hospital. So let me ask doctors that I know who are working in the trenches and look at what doctors are saying on Twitter feeds and stuff. And I'm seeing a lot of we test everybody, and if they come in for cancer or they come in for dialysis or come in for something else, and they test positive for COVID, they are recorded as a COVID patient. It's a case of COVID. It gets fed into the national statistics, and we're not seeing actually very many people with real symptoms of this disease. And then I'm like, got a data point from another doctor who's like, oh yeah, we're at 90% capacity, and this is real. I've seen more of the former than the latter. I saw a graph from Florida where alongside the spiking cases is a plummeting number of fatalities. And you mentioned at the beginning, at today's date, 128,000 in the U.S. have died from COVID, uh, and like that hasn't gone up that much actually. There haven't been more people dying. So who knows? And maybe the deaths will spike soon too. I don't know. Let me just say that I am deeply skeptical at this point, and increasingly skeptical of the official narratives. And anyway, I could go on and on, but maybe I'll pause for a moment here.
Yeah, sure. I do want to understand kind of what you see as the official narrative and the reasons for your skepticism. I do want to kind of unpack something um, that you mentioned around when you were talking about the example of Japan, um, and this is something I've been trying to square, which is that there is a rise in some parts of the world of authoritarianism, and I think you've eloquently outlined how authoritarianism might express itself kind of in the world of COVID. So mask wearing, surveillance, lockdown, infringements of other civil liberties. Um, but what's curious to me is that the authoritarian leaders in the West, um, Trump, Putin, Bolsonaro, Johnson to some degree, I don't know if you'd categorize Putin as the West, Modi, they they have been actually the champions of individual freedoms, actually, which is odd for me because you'd think, these are kind of more of the authoritarian kind of chest thumping leader types. And it has been the more social liberal democracies that have successfully engaged their citizenry to kind of make sacrifices, to mask wear, to sort of succumb to surveillance and certain infringements, kind of in the name of the common good. I think of like our Prime Minister Ardern in New Zealand, who could hardly be considered an authoritarian, yet she seemed to be able to kind of get her citizenry in lockstep around kind of recognizing the common good over their own individual self-interest. And I wonder kind of what you see inside of there, if anything.
Yeah, uh, there's a lot going on there. One is this blurring or mixing up of left and right, so that it's hard to distinguish who's left and who's right anymore. As you're saying, in traditionally, the right has been associated with authoritarianism, and the left associated with defying authority, question everything, with upholding civil liberties and protecting them from the excesses of state power. And now we're seeing generally the people who are questioning the standard narrative of COVID, which you asked me what that is. That's essentially that there's a dangerous virus causing this disease that is going to kill millions or tens of millions of people if we don't quarantine and lock down. At first, it was until we can flatten the curve, and then it became until we get a vaccine. It is generally the left that is aligned with our scientific and medical authorities, at least that aspect of authority, and mostly of our political authorities too. There are some exceptions, like Trump is definitely dragging his heels when it comes to quarantines and lockdowns and stuff. But most of our governors and national leaders are going along with it, at least. Even the ones you mentioned, Trump, Bolsonaro, are not resisting too much. Modi, I think, is quite gung ho about uh, lockdowns and surveillance and stuff like that. Anyway, so there's this weird reversal of left and right, and it I think it's one source of it is that the left has traditionally been aligned with science. Science, I mean, as an institution, as an establishment, because originally science was opposed to the reactionary forces of religion. So science was progressive. It was actually overturning authority not too many generations ago. It was science that was the challenger. It was science that was um, uh, it was a progressive force as opposed to religion, which espoused conservative values, family values, so called, and obedience to authority. It was the social order. So there's still this legacy of left identity with science, especially when it also seems to many that it is the denial of science or the failure to take it seriously, especially in the area of climate and ecology, that is leading us down a path of destruction. So I think that it is not actually that apparent to those on the left that, in fact, the authority of science as an established institution is inseparable from the rest of our systems of authority in this civilization, that it is embedded within political authority. It is intimately tied to economic, financial power. It is a central institution of our culture, and there's still this illusion that it is impartial and apolitical, and in this altruistic pursuit of the truth, of the objective truth, which is why, and this belief about science is almost universal to some degree in our culture, although now there are more and more defecting from it. But that's why both sides always seek to invoke science as being on their side, and the other side is not paying attention to the science. So what is the science? How do you, as a layperson, know what the science is? Or even how do you, as a scientist, know what it is? Generally, you gain that knowledge by what somebody is telling you the science is. You're not actually going into a lab and doing the science yourself. You have to take somebody's word for it. Either those who are in positions of authority or those who are questioning authority. So there you have it.
And would you say I suppose, the undermining of the institution of science, um, and that sort of contributes to this post-fact or post-truth society, fuels a lack of social cohesion, which is at the core of our inability to get our hands around this problem.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's not the issue. I mean, maybe it's not about social cohesion, but I think and maybe perfect social cohesion wouldn't help us. But my sense is that if we all kind of pretended that we were driving down the highway, just going as fast as the car in front of us, letting cars merge in regardless of their color and creed or whatever, that that we were all kind of playing our part in the social contract, that we would have sort of greater success. But because we cannot let alone agree, but even agree on the facts, it seems like there's this kind of dystopia, which is prohibiting us from having, thoughtful, meaningful conversations, around a shared goal.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder what you attribute kind of this sort of undermining of the belief in the institution of science. I mean, certainly you
Yeah.
can point out like, big pharma sponsoring, biased scientific studies for their own profiteering. But is there something kind of deeper, a deeper level than that?
Hmm. Yeah. So I agree with you. I do think that the our dwindling trust in science is part of the unraveling of our social cohesion. We used to have a unifying story of what the world was and what progress was, uh, not just economic progress, but also intellectual progress. We were ascending toward uh, the complete understanding and mastery of the universe. In physics, it was called the theory of everything. And it looked like we were almost there, actually, even back in the 1940s or 1950s. So that um, that unifying narrative has been breaking down, partly because of the reasons you mentioned, like the outright corruption of science, especially medical science. But I do think that there's something deeper afoot. Um, you mentioned post truth or post fact, um, and I think that we are also coming to question some of the metaphysical assumptions of science, which fundamentally is based on truth or fact existing. And let me say fact, actually, rather than truth, existing objectively outside of ourselves. It's a metaphysical assumption that that says that you can isolate variables, that and isolate the effect of the experimenter on the experiment. You can standardize experiments and therefore repeat experiments. That the reality that you interrogate does not change according to what questions you ask and what beliefs you hold about that reality. That reality is something separate from ourselves. So these um, tenets, these axioms, I would even call them, have been coming into doubt, actually, for many reasons. Well, I mean, one is that they are questionable within quantum mechanics, which confirms a relationship between the observed and the observer. So even on a scientific level, it has been decaying for almost 100 years. This trust that science is the expression of truth and the road to truth. And then I would also add that, and I don't think I'm alone, and I know I'm not alone here, that um, I've had many experiences in my life that science uh, it says is impossible, says are impossible, that could not have happened, that are not part of the reality that science narrates to us. And I know that many other people have had mystical experiences, experience of healing, psychedelic experiences, things that just, or have had relationships with indigenous people who hold different worldviews that do not correspond to the basic assumptions of science. And like you experience something like that. You go to a psychic who tells you something she could not possibly have known, very specific to your past, not just, oh, your third chakra is not spinning, but something like absolutely detailed and accurate. Or you um, go to an acupuncturist and your lifelong menstrual cramps, talking about a friend of mine, that have resisted every treatment disappear after one session. Or we have so many experience, or the UFO phenomenon, which we've been told is a fantasy by the scientific consensus. I once wrote an article. I quoted some guy: UFOs deserve as much study as Santa Claus. He was an astronomer, and now and people were ridiculed as tinfoil hat wearing cranks to be studying UFOs. And now all of a sudden, actually, it's been a couple of years now, the Navy confesses that they've been monitoring UFOs all the time and that they are unexplainable, and bringing out videos and testimony from trained observers. And like all of a sudden, something that has been out of bounds of reality is brought in. So
Right.
no wonder our faith in science is wavering. Plus, if I can just continue my rant just for one little more minute,
Please.
it's that the paradise, the utopia that science and its child's technology were supposed to bring us has not manifested. It has produced wonders. So, a cell phone, I mean, that was science fiction a generation ago. It has produced wonders, but has it actually delivered us into a society of greater joy and less suffering? Absolutely not. So, as a religion, as a dogma, as a path for human betterment, it's lost some of the luster that it had in the 50s when this with the hero scientist forging ahead into a brave new world where we would be free of disease and toil, and even on a social level, the social engineers were going to construct society to eliminate poverty and racism and psychological anguish, and like none of this has come to pass. So it's not just science, but it's the entire world story that embeds it that is disintegrating, I would say.
I think there may be an argument to be had on the role of science and how it has been able to potentially tame epidemics, pandemics, famine, but without, and also potentially war. Um, if you kind of subscribe to some sort of kind of assured mutual destruction philosophy, or kind of the global economy that's based around sort of scientific intellectual property that is so reliant on it that it may prohibit um, or lessen the probability of going to war. But that notwithstanding for a minute, I think that the point that you make around, whether or not there is an objective truth to be had, whether or not you can separate humans' experience of something from its existence, like gravity or relativity, can those things exist without our ability to perceive them? I don't know. I think that's open for a discussion. But as it pertains more to sociology and our ability to function cooperatively within society, we do require some form of intersubjective truth, I believe, in order to cohere. And what I have witnessed is sort of not necessarily the abandonment of the products of science, but almost the abandonment of its method to find some form of intersubjective truth. The notion of, hypothesis, experiment, observation, deductive reasoning, you know, modification of hypothesis, and then some form of thesis. We seem to have almost abandoned the rigor of that method, kind of in exchange for kind of a very decentralized sense of intuition that then, from a media or journalistic perspective, gets spread by individual vectors, celebrities, influencers, and that becomes our our um, our means for understanding the world. And that seems to me to be very concerning and
Mhm.
potentially very dangerous.
Yes. Um, it is astonishing to me how ignorant and hostile to science some very intelligent people can become. I'm in part of a group where there's a significant portion of the group. It's a chat group, I've just um, uh, a significant portion of the group believes that satellites are hoaxes and that the Earth is flat. And these are not, ignorant, you know, stereotypical Bible thumping fundamentalists. I mean, these are people with um, advanced professional degrees, and I take that as really symptomatic of the crisis of confidence that science faces. And I think that these people actually are mirroring something that's happened within science itself. It's not only that people who are outside of establishment science are not uh, faithful to the scientific method, but science itself has also lost its connection. You were saying to its rigorous application. I would say really the word to use is its humble application.
Mm, yeah.
Really, what science at its best embodies is humility. It says, I do not know, therefore I shall ask. I shall ask the world through an experiment to tell me what is true and what is not. So when I was questioning the metaphysical assumptions of science like objectivity, I'm not offering as an alternative that we invent truth, that truth is whatever we make of it or anything like that. I do think that there is such a thing as a truth that is beyond human beings and beyond human invention, and that our relationship to the world is in large part a discovery of this truth or even a coevolution with this truth, which is um, kind of a third position between the um, beliefs create reality, New Age view, and the reality is outside of ourselves, standard scientific view. So there's definitely some philosophical nuance that we could explore there. But I want to say also, this part of the breakdown of, I guess it's related to this humility that I was speaking of. Um, it, it the opposite of humility is arrogance. And like many religions, science has strayed, especially as an institution, from its basic spiritual core into its opposite. Like Christianity was supposed to be about
Mm.
forgiveness and non-judgment, and look what it became. It became about judgment and punishment, and you're a sinner, and uh, so this happens to institutions that are based on metaphysical principles and that's like a religion and that seek to explain the world like a religion and that tell us how to live in it like a religion and tell us where we came from like a religion and what our destiny is like a religion. I mean, science fulfills all of these uh, checks all the boxes for a religion, and it has departed from its core esoteric spirit, which is humility, into arrogance. And one form that arrogance takes is uh, an institutionalized confirmation bias and paradigm protection,
Mm, yeah.
which an individual scientist might be perfect. In fact, most of them that I meet are perfectly scrupulous people. They're not on purpose trying to exclude vast realms of truth, but it's how the funding works and how the promotions work and how the publishing works. And if you try to study as a scientist, if you decide you're going to study uh, UFOs, like boy, try to get that past your dissertation committee. Unless you're taking like some meta like sociological approach to it. I mean, or if you're going to try to study herbs as an alternative to remdesivir or to standard pharmaceutical medicines to treat coronavirus, like good luck getting funding for that when the institutions of research and funding are all driven by pharmaceutical profits. Like you're not going to get funding or much sympathy In fact, you'll get the opposite. You'll get hostility and scrutiny if you come up with a study that demonstrates that Artemisia annua is, as many African nations are saying, an effective treatment for COVID-19. It's this institutional thing. And of course, we also run into actual individual arrogance among scientists. And one form that this arrogance takes is we know how to do it better than anybody else. So you actually touched on a couple of those things, like, well, of course, science has helped us end famine and vastly increase crop yields. And most people just take that for granted. But if you actually look at some of the marginalized data, you find that like there's some of this from the Rodale Institute that demonstrates that if you really do it right, organic methods can outproduce conventional chemical intensive methods for many, if not most, categories of crops. Of course, it's much more labor intensive to do it, quote, do it right. So in order to grow all of our food sustainably, organically, or regeneratively, we'd have to have a lot more people on the land. But actually, like, the data has been selectively filtered and packaged and presented to make it look like technology has delivered us from famine. And I could give similar examples for medicine and many other. Oh, you mentioned also mutually assured destruction. That's actually a really interesting case, because I think what's going on there is a profound initiation for humanity out of the old story in which the final solution to your problem was the total destruction of the bad guy. And with the atomic bomb,
Mm-hmm.
like starting from the 1950s, that was no longer an option. There was no longer any realistic hope of the total vanquishing of your enemy, and that is a new paradigm. It is new information that I don't think even to this day, 70 years later, we've really integrated. Like we have to, and it was like the first stirring of a new story in which we are no longer at war with the other and no longer can solve our
Mm-hmm.
problems by finding something to kill, finding something to dominate, finding something to locking out the immigrants, killing the terrorists, killing the germs, wearing masks, washing your hands all the time, isolating so that this bad thing doesn't get you. It's all part of the same mentality that we are emerging from, as we understand that so many of our problems do not admit to a identifiable perpetrator. Like, you cannot blame autoimmunity, for example, which is the real epidemic of our time, as far as the number of, I mean, it's just incredible how autoimmune conditions have skyrocketed over my lifetime. There's not a pathogen there. You can't reduce poverty to a bad guy. And our society is very uncomfortable with any problem where we can't externalize a perpetrator and solve the problem by dominating the perpetrator.
Mm. Yeah, it's fascinating. You touched on that in the conspiracy myth article, and it prompted me to think about this, that in the absence of a bad guy, or I guess puppets, i- i- is it more the systems and structures that we are enslaved to? And of course, I think about you know capitalism potentially in the forefront of that. Particularly as it pertains to the institution of journalism, which has a very strong code of ethics traditionally, um, around multiple sources and independent confirmations, and reporting errors, and all of the kind of typical ethics associated with journalism, but certainly, you know, focusing on, whether it's sort of showing the video of George Floyd or Rayshard Brooks, or any other forms of incredibly incendiary um, news, is driving clicks, which is driving kind of CPM based revenue. And if you start to kind of dig, of course, our sources of media are of the private sector largely. And it begs, I suppose, the question at some point, like, can they be fully entrusted um, to deliver, fact around which we can cohere? Um, I also wonder if if that the intolerance for conspiracy um, almost fuels the conspiracy itself. And what I think, what you talk about, and you're very unique, and I really appreciate this about you, is that in some ways you're more about facilitating the nuanced conversations around these issues instead of coming at them from a black and white perspective. And I think, that's, if there's anything that we need in our society, it is conversation. So I am very grateful for that. And I do think there is a delineation to be made between the kind of critical thinking and skepticism that you're referring to, which is certainly, um, echoed throughout history from, you know, Galileo or any modern philosopher thoroughly questions the status quo in order to sort of shift the paradigm forward. And we need to be skeptical and questioning the status quo. At the same time, I think what we've also seen is a promulgating of ideas with no basis in fact whatsoever. Whether that's Pizzagate, the birther movement, QAnon, Bill Gates, and the implanting of microchips, COVID being engineered in a Wuhan lab, 5G. I mean, you can go on and on. And I wonder if there is any litmus test you use to delineate between ideas that might buck the status quo, that are based in some actual real critical thought, versus stuff that is just completely specious.
Well, that's a great question. Um, yeah, first, I would say that um, all of those things you mentioned, well, most of them anyway, uh, I would ask, how do you know that they have no basis in fact? Like, have you actually investigated them not from the point of view of their critics, but from the point of view of their adherents? Have you gone into their original literature? Most people have not. So you actually don't know if they have a basis in fact or not. It's because they don't fit your beliefs that you assume that they must not have a basis in fact. Because how could they? Because they're not true. So they must not have a basis in fact.
Yeah, but I would just say, and I'll let you go on this, but that Pizzagate is not confirmation bias, and neither is Obama's birth certificate, and some of these, I think, other ones that
Yeah.
feel maybe on the thinnest edge of the branch.
So just to be
I
clear,
digress.
I think that Barack Obama was born in Hawaii and was legitimately elected president of the United States. Okay, let me just say that uh,
Yeah.
before I say, how do you know? How do you know? That's what critical thinking is. Critical thinking is it goes to the level of how do I know, and
Mhm.
and what are my biases? What am I not looking at? And then it applies that to the ideas that we are engaging. Like, where did that idea come from? Who does it serve? Um, what is not being said with this idea. Like one of the reasons that I engage current issues from this sort of meta perspective is that often I think that the way that the issue is framed is part of the problem. Anytime you engage a debate about X versus Y, you are implicitly agreeing that this debate of X versus Y is the right debate to have. But often, what I'm seeing today, especially, is that these debates obscure the actual important issues that are therefore maintained. The status quo is maintained by the kind of debates that we are having that divert attention away from the deeper issues. So, for example, if we argue about, and I would love to talk about pizzagate. I mean, that's a very, very interesting. Boy, there's a lot of things I want to say at once, but I'll quickly say
We've
that
got plenty of time, so go
an
ahead.
example is about, like these statues, should we topple the statues or leave them up, maybe change their plaques to give more of a historical context for them, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, like it's not that I don't have an opinion on this, but if you actually want to help, if you actually want to improve the position of Black and brown people on this planet, the number one thing that we've got to be talking about is third world debt. That is what is immiserating hundreds of millions of Black and brown people. And I don't see that as even remotely part of the race conversation anywhere. Maybe on a very few far left fringes, there's some talk of that. But it's completely absent because we're all mesmerized by the current spectacle, the show that generates so much smoke and clamor that we never even look at the man behind the curtain. And that's just one example of like, by even entering a debate, what are we implicitly agreeing about? What do both sides fail to question? What do both sides unconsciously agree on? Same thing in the climate controversy, where it's all about, is global warming happening or not? And everyone's arguing about the data and has the data been adjusted to make it look like more warming, et cetera, et cetera. And meanwhile, we have ecosystem destruction going on that disrupts the physiology of this living organism called Earth that will destroy life on Earth, whether or not temperatures are rising or that CO2 is causing it. But very few people are actually talking about this crisis, which makes it seem that if the global warming people are wrong, then it's okay to cut down the Amazon because we're reducing a very complex phenomenon to something simple. So this is one of the tendencies of our society. So the way that I treat these things, I mean, you did ask me a question like, where do I draw the line? But the first thing I do is I ask, how do I know that what I believe is true? And what is it like to be somebody who I disagree with? So I mentioned before the flat Earth theory, which basically says that the North Pole is at the center of the Earth. It's a disk. And what we call Antarctica is actually a ring of icy mountains around the Earth. And that's like the beginning of it. And they have all kinds of things to explain every question that you could come up with and all kinds of points that you would have trouble explaining to me. Like, why is it possible on Oahu to see things happening on the beach of Maui 70 miles away? I just made up those numbers, but that's the kind of thing, like because it should be under 600 feet of curvature. Like, why can you see them? Do you know the answer to that? Or do you just assume? So like I actually went into this. I read the flat Earth hypothesis from its adherents. And I'm like, okay, is this actually coherent? Like taking it at its best. That's rare to take an opposing view at its best. Usually we take it at its worst. But I can't remember which of the French revolutionaries said that the secret to his debating prowess, I think it might have been Rousseau or somebody, he was an undefeatable debater. And he said, the reason is that I make sure that I can argue my opponent's position better than he can. So this is essential to actually develop critical thinking, and I would say to develop intelligence. It's imperative to step outside of your conceptual framework and beliefs into another one, because that's how our rigid frameworks soften and we become able even to entertain new ideas. So, like a lot of these things you mentioned, if you go into Pizzagate, like I'm not buying into necessarily that a pedophilia elite controls the whole world. I mean, the real Pizzagate actually is not about a pizza restaurant. If you go into it, it got its name because of these weird emails that showed up in the Podesta WikiLeaks,
Yeah.
that are, it's like we're organizing this fundraiser, in Washington, and we will source our pizzas and hot dogs from the usual source in Chicago. And it's like, what's that doing there? What are they talking about? And it turns out pizzas are like a code word for underage girls. And like
Right.
that's how Pizzagate got its name. And like so like there's these weird data points that are like, it's almost like they're incursions from another reality, from a shadow reality. And that's how I sit with these various conspiracy theories, because you can go as far down the rabbit hole as you want into weirder and weirder territory, to the Luciferian elite controlling the planet, to their alien overlords pulling the strings, from like there's no, the Earth is flat, satellites are hoaxes. Like there's no clear dividing line. So I know you sound like you want to interject, but
No, I
I'll
mean, my only, my first of all, I think you make a compelling case for empathy. Really, the ability to, I think, really place yourself into someone else's perspective and take their argument at its best. That's a beautiful and maybe revolutionary thought, given the kind of discourse that we are habituated to seeing, particularly on the internet. Um, but I do get quite concerned when there are real world consequences to tolerance, such that for example, you know, Pizzagate did lead to a man entering a Washington pizzeria and firing a rifle. Or, I mean, 5G, that particular theory led to the destruction of telecommunication towers all over Europe. Even I read, I think last night, that in Bolivia, where 5G doesn't even exist, there was such a belief in the fact that COVID was being transmitted through 5G technology that they burned down their own telecommunication towers.
uh
I mean, these kind of real world consequences through, I suppose, you know, empathy and tolerance are, you know, need to be taken into account, and I would
well,
say are
I mean, I would
concerning.
question whether that's coming from empathy and tolerance. Um, but again,
Yeah.
I would look at, okay, what are we being shown by the prevalence of beliefs like uh, COVID is being spread by 5G. Now, actually, that is the rendition of that theory that is offered by its critics. Have you actually looked into the what the 5G, let's call them 5G, anti 5G activists are saying about the relationship between 5G and COVID? I don't actually buy what they're saying, but it's not what you're
Yeah,
saying.
only insofar that I know that there was a paper generated by a physicist, I believe in Florida. I don't remember his name offhand, but that showed, um, you know, a certain reaction of the brain to 5G radio waves. But the critique to that is that it didn't take into account that a human's brain is encased in a skull. but beyond that, I will readily admit I am not fluent with the
Yeah.
argument, and I probably should be.
So
Your
just
point is
again to be
taken.
clear, I do
Yeah.
not think that COVID is caused by 5G. However, I do think that 5G and microwave radiation in general is more dangerous than we're being told.
Mhm.
And there are voluminous studies of this. I mean, if you are interested in looking at them, I can send them to you that uh, detail the effects of non-ionizing radiation on biological systems, and study the effect of on birds and insects within X distance of cell phone towers, and like I mean, there's and plants. I mean, there's just a lot of evidence that is not really allowed into the conversation because it is disruptive to prevailing paradigms. It's disruptive to financial interests. It's inconvenient. Um, so because it is being kept out, there's no way for you or for me to actually know what relationship, if any, there is between 5G or I mean 4G, 3G, whatever, and various health conditions, or glyphosate is another big one.
Mhm.
So I mean, I could, I don't want to take the time to, but I could go through some of the um, theoretical reasons, the physiological reasons why people suspect some kind of connection between microwave frequencies and um, COVID-19. But I won't go into them now. I'll just say that they're there. There are scientists, PhD researchers who are writing papers that and publishing them that um, are warning of the dangers of these artificial frequencies. And I could have a whole conversation about where I agree and disagree and what I think the shortcomings of that worldview are and what I think it's illuminating that we need to pay attention to. I mean, that could be an entire podcast in and of itself. But but I guess to return to my main point about critical thinking, um, on a broad civilizational level, we desperately need to start questioning some of what we thought we knew as a society, about how to be a society, about what's real, about what's important, about how to run this world. That
Mm.
Because the healing that we seek is only to be found outside of the worldviews that have created the mess that we're in right now. To paraphrase
Mm.
Einstein, and we need to start looking toward the indigenous cultures, toward the wisdom lineages within our own cultures, toward the kinds of people that have been excluded, uh, whether you know um, racially excluded or ethnically excluded, or just the kinds of human abilities that have been demeaned in our current system. You go to school, and if you're like me, everyone's telling you how great you are and how smart you are. Because why? Because you're good at linear thinking, analysis, reason, and rote memorization. Like I was really good at that. So everybody celebrated those, and I was supported in developing those gifts. But if I had been in school and I had a gift for perceiving human energy fields, or making plants grow, or communicating with animals, or anything like that, either I would have been totally ignored, or I would have been pathologized.
I want to ask you how you think it is possible, or if you think it is possible, to have these kinds of thorough conversations with people with whom we might not agree, um, given that our public forums for the free exchange of ideas among individuals have largely disintegrated. And the way that we tend to communicate with each other is through 280 characters or less, which are generally characterized as screaming matches in an echo chamber or sort of like private acts happening in public on Twitter or Facebook. Um, how do we have these conversations? I mean, if you believe that the success of humankind is our ability to cooperate flexibly at scale, um, it feels like that ability has significantly eroded.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you have any solutions for us.
Yeah. I mean, that, you're really drilling down to something near the root of our crisis today. It's fundamentally a crisis in communication. When we cohere around common meanings and a common story, there's almost nothing that we cannot do as humanity. Our collective story tells us who we are and what we're here for, what we're doing, and assigns roles for us to play in making that a reality. I'd like to point this out in and I'll get you. I will answer your question, but like when I talk about regenerative agriculture and what it would take to convert our agricultural system to produce just as much food as right now and sequester 100% of anthropogenic emissions. It would, I made this very, very rough calculation. It would take something like 10% of global military budgets. 10%. And we could have a completely sustainable, healing planet. 10%. Not hard,
Yeah.
not technically hard, but impossible right now. Although COVID-19 is maybe showing us that what we thought was impossible may be within reach because we've made such massive changes, and it leads us to think, what other massive changes could we make? But no changes will happen if, as you're alluding to, our means of forming a coherent narrative have broken down. And the reason, it's not, I don't think it's so much the length of Twitter posts, but it's the intention with which we enter these so-called conversations. If your intention is to win, if you approach it through the lens of a debate, and your intention is to win, and the other side is doing that too, then basically what has become important to you and the God that you are serving is winning and not truth. What we need in order to get out of that stuck holding pattern is to step into service to the truth. And really, when I mentioned humility before as the spiritual essence of science, I'm talking about humility here. Humility is devotion to truth above all else. And putting aside, like imagine if what it takes to change this world is that you have to let go of being proved right and let go of your opponents ever admitting that they were wrong. Are you willing to make that sacrifice? Are you willing to sacrifice being vindicated? Are you willing, if that's what it takes, to go down in history of being as having been wrong and your opponents were right? Because guess what? You're wrong about something. I don't know what. And same for me. I'm wrong, dead wrong about something. And it could be something important, probably more than one thing, maybe even two things. If you ask my wife, maybe three or four. So what's it going to take for us to, if we are oriented toward victory and winning a debate, and we enter the debate in that spirit, and we marshal our information and we select for information that serves winning and select out the information that would be inconvenient and might actually help the opponent, and justify that exclusion of something true because, after all, we're on the good side. So let's not admit any, say we're anti-Trump, and here comes something good that he did. Well, we better not talk about that. Or here comes a hole in the Russia collusion narrative. Oh, better not let that one in. So this is how there's no way that we're ever going to enter the kinds of conversations that you're talking about, that you really want to see happen and that do produce a coherence and a common narrative that at least incorporates enough of humanity for us to move forward. We're never going to have that if we are not in service to something, in service to truth rather than winning.
Yeah. Yeah. I suppose being wrong is an essential component of a well-functioning liberal democracy, because Charles wins this debate and gets elected and, executes around his platform, and some of it works and some of it doesn't. And he gets voted out next time and I win and I get to do it. And then, you're hoping that there is that, we're inching forward down the arc of the moral universe, even at a bumper to bumper kind
Yeah.
of pace.
Yeah. It's written into our politics. I mean, every system that we have embodies this paradigm of competition and dominance. The revolution that we are undergoing goes so deep.
Yeah. Kind of the last topic I'd love to just prod at, if you'll indulge me, is some of the writing that you did around fear and death.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not disconnected from science or empiricism, I suppose. Because as I've started to think about it, kind of the shift from a faith-based society, in which death was sort of the providence of God on some level, where Western medicine had not yet, uh, told us all the answers physiologically. That there was a sense of kind of fatalism and around death, and a tremendous amount of meaning placed into what happened after death. And kind of with the emergence of, I suppose, the Enlightenment and science and empiricism and Western allopathic medicine, death sort of became no longer the providence of God, but the providence of medicine. Like when you die now, it's like generally someone's fault in some way, or it's easy to assign some form of blame.
Well, it's a medical event,
And
even, you could say. Death is a medical event. Yeah.
correct, yeah. And in a way, because now we don't see, because we understand sort of life and death in these very sort of empirical and physiological terms, that we ascribe tremendous meaning to this very, very short lifespan, to the point that we sanctify and treasure it so much that we either live in kind of denial or fear of the terminus. And you talk about this kind of much more kind of eloquently than I do. So I wonder if you could
Mm-hmm.
spend a little time talking about that.
Yeah. So I think that what you said is part of it, that when we circumscribe our lives, our identity, as beginning at birth and ending at death, and that's it. That death is the total annihilation of the self, of consciousness. That does make us fear death all the more, and make the prevention of death the most important purpose of life and of medicine, especially. In medicine, death is considered the worst possible outcome. So you have absurd situations where someone is kept on a respirator, um, suffering horribly alone in a COVID ward somewhere for months before they die. And that's considered a better outcome than they died in a day surrounded by their loved ones. So But I think that another way that we circumscribe ourselves that leads to a greater fear of death is not uh, just temporal, but it's also um, relational. That who we really are is more than a separate individual, but we are the totality of our relationships and of our connections, and that there's a intimate relationship uh, between my existence and your existence, and the existence of every being on this earth. Like we are, as Thich Nhat Hanh puts it, we are interbeings, not
Mm.
separate individuals. And other cultures held a much more fluid, broader understanding of what it is to be, what it is to be a self. You couldn't even, in many languages, there was no word for exist. And if you ask somebody to picture yourself just existing, that would have been nonsense. Or they would have maybe pictured themselves with their families or with their tribes. Existence wasn't something that a separate self does. So when we have narrowed who we are to this discrete, separate individual, then of course we're more afraid of death. But when we pour our beingness into the world, and understand that everything that we've given toward life and beauty uh, outlives us and sends ripples out into the future, then the fear of death subsides, just as it subsides when we understand that this lifetime that we can measure is only part of a greater existence. And these two ideas are actually related. What exactly is it that survives, and who are you anyway?
Mm.
That gets at some of these more mysterious questions. But yeah, like our society is so geared around preventing death and maintaining, and that would be the ultimate victory of science. That's where it's
Yeah.
going, to conquer death itself. That's the ultimate frontier, and the greatest ambition. And to through genetic engineering and nanotechnology and uh, uploading our consciousness into computers and so forth, like that, we can conquer death. Is um, That's the ultimate expression of the scientific program. And so that's, today we see that written into our response to COVID-19, where prolonging life or postponing death at any cost outweighs many other human values that other cultures may have put before uh, postponing death as long as possible. So who's to say that it's worth it to no longer have gatherings and dances and group hugs and weddings and carnivals and concerts and all the things that we used to do, that we've sacrificed on the altar of safety. And I'm not saying that individual freedom or uh, dances and gatherings and so forth are of overriding importance either. What I'm saying is that we have conflicting values here that that
Hmm.
invite us into a complicated, into a nuanced conversation, as you would say. But our society has taken one as the trump card, as the overridingly important. We have to keep safe. And what is your life like if your first priority is to make sure that you are as safe as possible? That's no
Yeah.
life.
Yeah. I mean, if you could imagine sort of not even immortality, but sort of amortality, where essentially every organ in your body could be replaced or regenerated every 10 years. Um, but you could still get, hit by a bus
Right.
and die if you kind of play this thought experiment out with me. Um, can you imagine what that would be like? The risk that you would take uh, to risk your amortality. I mean, you'd never go outside, right?
Right.
If you're like, well, wait a minute, like I can live forever, or I might get hit by this bus, um, and Yuval Harari wrote a pretty interesting book called Homo Deus, which kind of talks about this at some great length, that the final conquest after kind of defeating famine, disease, and war is immortality, and all of the ways that we are kind of going about doing that. And I'm kind of close to it in the longevity movement, and which in some ways is sort of maybe just a pit stop on the way to an immortality or an amortality movement.
Yeah.
But all of the, trinkets and devices and heart rate variability monitors and glucose monitors and aura rings and, that are, being developed kind of in the name of longevity, as if longevity is the holder of all of the value.
Jeff, can I say two things about longevity here?
Yeah, please.
One is, however long you live, when you're in your last minute, it won't matter. All you'll have is that minute. Secondly, there is a wisdom, a body wisdom in the lifespans that we currently have, and other animals too. Like there's a reason why dogs live 10 or 15 years and why humans live, 80 years. And that's what it takes to live a full life. Every experience that a dog is supposed to have to live a full dog's life, you don't really need more than 10, 15 years. And at our current stage of evolution, a full human life is accomplished in all of its stages and all of its transformations and challenges in about 80 years, from your childhood, your first love, your initiation to manhood, et cetera, your family, your career, your period of struggle, your period of building on what you've and harvesting the fruits of what you've sown, your becoming a grandparent, and maybe ending with your grandson's child on your knee. Like that is a full life. And there are many variants on it, of course. I don't want to normalize that particular variant, but basically you get your full complement of the human experience in about 80 years. And that is why none of these technologies are actually going to work very well and might even cause more harm than good. And I think, we're starting to get an inkling of this when we look at, what happens when you enhance telomerase. Like your telomeres don't shorten as fast, but you get cancer, like there is a glass ceiling, a limit to how well these longevity technologies are going to work, as long as we are living the kinds of lifespans that we are living today. And our longevity will only dramatically increase when the basic trajectory of a human life changes. And that is why those who have accomplished extraordinary longevity, the ones I know about are the Taoist sages, who have lifespans of hundreds of years. They can only do that by really leaving society. They have to exit the matrix and the consensus reality and the life path that most people are on. Otherwise, they don't need to live that long. Like, what's the point? Why do we want to have super long lives if we think that our existence ceases at the moment of death?
Thank you for listening to this week's episode with thinker and author Charles Eisenstein. You can find his recent essays on his website, charleseisenstein.org. And if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for me, please feel free to email me at jeffk@onecommune.com. I try to respond to every message. And that's it from the Commune for this week. My name is Jeff Krasno, and I am here for you.